a biblical perspective on life, culture, and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, it's Friday and we are joined by Bill Muehlenberg from Culture Watch. And Bill, today we're going to talk about rock stars, rejection and acceptance.
Yes. Well, I assume most of your listeners would know of at least some of the rock stars I do speak to in a new article. Eric Clapton, the guitarist, English bluesman. A few others you might have heard of. George Harrison, one of the Beatles. So I mentioned some of these guys in a piece. And it really flows from a documentary I saw just recently on TV about Clapton's life. I guess if I were a real groupie or really into these guys, I would have known these things, but I picked up some new facts about Clapton, including the fact that basically he was rejected by his own mother very early on, a product of a one-night stand, I believe, and she farmed him off to somebody else. When she did come back and Eric said, "Oh, can I finally have you as my mommy?" She flatly said no. So talk about heartache, talk about rejection when your own biological mother really wants nothing to do with you. So the funny thing is I was going through my own smaller bit of rejection at the very time I saw this doco. So I thought, well, probably most people in life have experienced one way or another rejection. Could be knocked back at a job offer. Maybe you made a proposal to the love of your life and she rejected you, or any number of things we can experience rejection in, some more serious than others. So the question is, how did Eric respond to all this? How do we respond? A lot of questions arise here.
Well, it's a good question. I didn't know. I mean, that is just an awful thought to have your own mum to reject you. But isn't it amazing how sometimes when people go through such hardship and suffering, it builds something or creates some strength or determination inside of him. I think Winston Churchill also was very rejected by his own mother because he was sent to boarding school and he would want to come home for Christmas. It was only a 2-hour carriage ride away. And his mum would literally say to him, "No, son, just stay at the boarding school," because she was a partying lady that liked to party and didn't want him getting in the way. And again, but look at the man that Churchill became despite that rejection.
A lot of stories like that of hardcore rejection, often from family or loved ones. And as we know, any kind of these difficulties, there's, two paths to take, right? It can make you better, it can make you bitter, right? It can be a stumbling stone or a stepping block. It all depends on how we respond. Sadly, the rest of the story of Eric Clapton, at least for the next 20, 30 years, wasn't very good. He responded in all the wrong ways, became a heroin addict, alcoholic, womanizer, went through a series of affairs. In fact, it said, I think in one of his biographies, just as his own mother rejected him, he kind of felt, I can go and misuse and abuse women and reject them as well. So that even included the wife of George Harrison that he had a relationship with. So pretty much of a downward spiral. He was not replying or responding rightly. He was doing all the wrong things, making the wrong choices. So when he finally did snap out of it, it took a real tragedy. And as many of you would know, his 4-year-old son, perished, I think, on the 53rd floor of a New York apartment building. He was away. The gal he was with, for some reason, the window was open, and, he went out, and, that was the end. So that really got Eric thinking, put an end to his wild ways, and the song Tears in Heaven that many of you know, which got a lot of rave reviews. That was written a year later about the loss of his son. So for him, horrible hardships, rejection, he responded in all the wrong ways, but finally it took an even greater tragedy to him kind of snap out of it and realize, hey, this is not the way to go. Life is more than just looking after myself, being drunk every day, and so on.
Yeah, it's such a sad story, isn't it, how his son fell out of that window. Just awful. But like you said, it was obviously an epiphany in his life for him to change things up and turn his life around.
Yeah, well, often it's sad. I hate to say it, it takes those kind of things before we finally wake up, right? I mean, I've shared my story as a depressed, bummed out hippie who, by the way, did like Eric Clapton at the time, enjoyed Cream and Blind Faith and all the super groups he was a part of back then. But, suicide, depression, drug use. I mean, I was, a lot of my friends didn't make it. So I was almost a goner as well. So it took that kind of despair coming to the end of my rope that when I did finally hear the gospel, I jumped. I've tried everything else. Nothing else is working. So either this is going to do it or I'm toast. So that is often, sadly, for many people, the way it has to go. You have to hit rock bottom before you can turn around. Now, as to Eric, whether he has become a Christian from this, I'm not sure. So if nothing else, we can pray for him, right? He's turned his life around many ways, which is, well done. We're glad for him. But the ultimate acceptance, right, that we need has to come to God through Christ, knowing we're accepted in him, in the beloved, which I finished the rest of my article on. That is the ultimate acceptance, and that is the ultimate cure to rejection.
Yeah, absolutely. Bill, out of interest in your own story, when you became a Christian, did you get that sense of acceptance, that you really sensed that God loved you? And was that a real key for you to keep walking with the Lord?
Yeah, well, it was part of that journey. I discussed my testimony in a long article, actually, I wrote some years ago. It was a bit of a process, but at the risk of sounding too melodramatic, but there was actually a one brief episode before I actually gave my life to Christ, maybe, I don't know, a few months before. I think I wrote it in my 4-part article called My Testimony. But one night I was home alone in my home, bummed out again, depressed, suicidal, high on drugs. And I tried a few times, at least weak-hearted attempts to take my life. This time I was a bit more serious, determined to get an end of it all. And as I was sitting there alone in that room that night, there's somebody else was in the room with me, right? I knew there was a presence there, and even though I was a pagan, right, I knew exactly who it was. I knew it was Jesus. For some reason, nothing was said, didn't last long, but that brief encounter, that presence that I knew to be Jesus. Well, I put the knife away and that was the end of that suicide attempt. And as I say, a few months later, perhaps, is when I did finally commit to Christ. So, you get some pretty hardcore things that really wake you up, shake you up. And sometimes it's rock bottom stuff that shakes you up. And then sometimes it's knowing, wow, despite how I've messed everything up, screwed up my life, there is acceptance in God through Christ. He hasn't washed his hands of me. He hasn't given up on me. In fact, he was there with me in my hardship and depression. So, that's the key to all the rejection we know. It's his acceptance, even though we're really not all that acceptable, all that lovely, right? I wouldn't have accepted myself. Who wants him? But God somehow loves us in our sin and loves us as we are, but enough to turn us around, to make us new creatures in Christ. So I always say, if there's hope for me, there's hope for Eric and there's hope for anybody.
Yeah, and I like how you said when people hit rock bottom, they often turn to the Lord. And the study of Israel in the Old Testament is one of that, isn't it? They're blessed, they prosper, they forget about God. Then they get invaded or attacked again and everything goes downhill again and they turn back to God. And it's really like that. And you do hope, don't you, Bill, just pivoting off that the Western world, which is right now on the decline, I think a stat that came out yesterday in an interview we had was that in the last 4 years, the standard of living in Australia has dropped the most. than it has in 50 years. Like, our standards of living are dropping in the West. We're getting political turmoil, all sorts of problems. You hope and pray, don't you, Bill, that the Western world will also turn their hearts back to the Lord, back to our Christian roots.
Yeah, absolutely. What you say about ancient Israel, how they fell and fell again and again, right? Happens to nations, happens to countries. Start off great often. I think, well, certainly America had a great Christian heritage. Australia did as well. There's entire websites. Your namesake, Graham McLennan, right, has got a fantastic Australia's Christian history, thousands of documents really on all the neat Christian things that helped to lead to the founding of Australia. But today, as you say, it's like most Western countries, turning its back on God, largely pagan, largely secular. So you ask the same question, how much further down does it have to go? How many more tragedies have to be fought before it wakes up, or will it wake up? That's the question, right? I was just thinking this last night. I was thinking, well, Lord, Trump may not be perfect, but boy, if Kamala and Walsh get in, I just can't, America is toast. But then you think, well, God allowed sometimes Israel's enemies to at least temporarily triumph. So I hope America doesn't have to go this way where it has to get that low down. But he would know better than I, obviously, what it's going to take to wake up America. He knows what's going to take to wake up Australia. So, yeah, it's unfortunate we don't learn sooner. And by the way, it's not just getting saved that often comes through hitting rock bottom, but how often do Christians, right, kind of go through the same cycle as Israel? They kind of, doing great for a while, loving the Lord, then kind of get slack and complacent and carnal, and next thing you know, they're back on the bottom again. They have to recommit to God. So in a sense, we Christians, we can have the same issue if we're not careful. We can forget who he is, forget that we're accepted and beloved, and then look to other fake alternatives to find that acceptance and love that we all want.
Yeah, when the only acceptance that really satisfies is the acceptance that comes from God's love. Well, Bill, I just want to thank you. This has gone so quick. It's been so good. But your blog is called The Bill Muehlenberg. It's on the BillMuehlenberg.com website. Now, this one's called Rockstars, Rejection and Acceptance. It's the third one down. An excellent piece. You wrote it on the 7th of October. I encourage all of our listeners to check out your website, BillMuehlenberg.com or CultureWatch.com. But as always, Bill, a pleasure having you on this show. And thank you for your insights and sharing your heart with us today on 2020.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.